In 1963, Ford Motor Company wanted Ferrari. Not a partnership, not a racing sponsorship. Ford wanted the entire company. The deal looked logical. Ford had enormous industrial power, Ferrari had racing prestige, and Enzo Ferrari needed capital to keep his racing operation alive. Negotiations moved forward. Lawyers and accountants examined the business. And for a moment, one of the most famous American corporations in the world appeared ready to acquire one of the most prestigious racing brands in Europe. Then, Enzo Ferrari saw the condition that mattered most. Ford wanted control over the racing operation, and Ferrari's founder had spent his life building one thing above everything else: racing. The deal collapsed. Ford went home without Ferrari, but Henry Ford II did not simply accept the loss. He decided to beat Ferrari, where Ferrari was strongest: at Le Mans. To understand why the feud became so personal, you have to understand what Ford was trying to buy. Ferrari was not simply another car manufacturer. Its road cars helped finance an obsession with motorsport, and its reputation was being built on racing success. Ford, meanwhile, was an industrial giant with enormous manufacturing capability, but it did not possess Ferrari's position in European endurance racing. Acquiring Ferrari could have given Ford an instant entrance into that world. But the same deal that made sense financially created a problem culturally. Ford wanted control, Ferrari wanted autonomy. When the final negotiations reached that point, the interests were no longer compatible. On May 22, 1963, Ford and Ferrari announced that negotiations had been suspended. The acquisition was over. And that failure created something neither side had planned for: a war. Ford could have walked away. Instead, the company changed the objective. If it could not own Ferrari, it would defeat Ferrari. And the target was not just another race. It was the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the brutal endurance event where speed alone was never enough. The car had to survive. The gearbox had to survive. The brakes, suspension, engine, drivers, pit crews, everything had to survive for 24 hours. Ford therefore had to build, almost from scratch, a machine capable of challenging a racing organization that had spent decades mastering this environment. The project brought together Ford engineering, British designer Eric Broadley, John Wyer, Carroll Shelby, and eventually a team of drivers and engineers who would spend years turning an ambitious idea into a weapon. The result was called the GT40. The GT40 was fast, very fast, but speed was not the problem. Reliability was. Ford was attempting in months what Ferrari had refined over decades. At the 1964 Le Mans race, the Ford car showed enough speed to make an impression, but none survived to the finish. One Ford had even led for part of the race, and the GT40 demonstrated tremendous straight-line performance, but transmission failures ended the challenge. Ford had entered the war and discovered that having more horsepower did not mean having a better endurance machine. The first lesson was brutal. Le Mans did not care how much money Ford had. It only cared which machine was still running when 24 hours were over. Then came 1965. Ford returned with a more developed GT40, and the car was faster. But once again, Le Mans exposed the difference between performance and durability. Ford's cars suffered mechanical failures, while Ferrari continued to dominate. The result was devastating. Ferrari swept the top 3 positions, extending its Le Mans winning streak to 6 consecutive victories from 1960 through 1965. Ford had spent enormous resources, recruited elite racing talent, redesigned the car, and still could not finish the job. At this point, the project could have been canceled. Instead, Ford made a different decision. it stopped trying to make the existing formula slightly better and began building something more powerful. The answer was power, but not power alone. Ford developed a larger 427 cubic inch V8 for the GT40 program, creating the Mark II. The engineering challenge was enormous. More power meant more stress. More weight meant greater demands on the brakes and chassis. Every improvement created another problem that had to be solved. Ken Miles became central to the development process, while Carroll Shelby and his team transformed the car's racing setup. Aerodynamics were revised, suspension was modified, brakes were improved, cooling was reconsidered. The gearbox remained a concern. The team was no longer simply building a faster car. It was building a system capable of surviving the punishment that had destroyed the earlier versions. And slowly, the GT40 stopped being Ford's experiment. It became a serious racing machine. The transformation was not instant. Ford had to learn how to race an endurance program, not simply manufacture a racing car. The company created a more coordinated structure around the Le Mans effort, bringing together Ford Engineering, Shelby American, Holman and Moody, and other specialists. The goal was no longer to rely on one brilliant component. The entire operation had to work. In 1966, the GT40 Mark II finally began delivering the performance Ford had been chasing. At Daytona, Ford took a dominant victory, proving the machine could survive a 24-hour endurance race. Then came Sebring, where Ferrari entered a factory car, and Ford won again. The psychological balance had shifted. Ford was no longer chasing Ferrari. Ferrari was now looking at a Ford machine that had finally learned how to finish. June 18th, 1966, Le Mans. Ford arrived with a fleet of GT40 Mark IIs, and Ferrari remained the benchmark. The race began at 4 in the afternoon. For hours, Ford and Ferrari traded positions, while the cars were pushed to extraordinary speeds. But endurance racing has its own mathematics. Every lap increases mechanical stress. Every pit stop creates risk. Every component has a breaking point. As the night progressed, Ferrari's cars began falling out with mechanical problems. Ford's machines kept running. By the early morning, the balance had changed completely. Ferrari's factory challenge had disappeared. Ford now had multiple cars at the front. And for the first time in the history of this rivalry, the American giant had Ferrari exactly where it wanted it. When the 24 hours were finally over, Ford had done what had seemed almost impossible 3 years earlier. The GT40 took the first 3 positions. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon finished first, followed by the other Ford entries. Ferrari's extraordinary Le Mans dominance had been broken. Ford had not bought Ferrari. It had not copied Ferrari. It had built a competing system and defeated Ferrari on Ferrari's own stage. The victory was more than a trophy. It was the final result of a corporate decision that had transformed humiliation into engineering discipline. A failed acquisition had become a racing program. The racing program had become an engineering laboratory. And that laboratory had produced one of the most famous victories in automotive history. What makes this story fascinating is that the real battle was never only between 2 cars. It was between 2 business philosophies. Ferrari built scarcity, prestige, racing heritage, and emotional value around a relatively small production base. Ford operated at industrial scale. Millions of cars could roll through Ford factories. The company possessed manufacturing power, engineering resources, capital, and an enormous organization. But scale alone could not buy racing credibility. Ford had to earn it. Ferrari, meanwhile, had something Ford could not manufacture overnight: decades of reputation. That is why the failed acquisition mattered so much. Ford was not simply denied an asset, it was denied a shortcut. And instead of taking the shortcut, it built its own road. There is a deeper business lesson inside the rivalry. Sometimes the fastest way to enter a market is acquisition. Buy the brand, buy the technology, buy the talent, buy the distribution. But when the acquisition fails, the company faces a choice: abandon the market or build the capability itself. Ford chose the second path, and that choice created something acquisition could never have produced in the same way. It forced Ford to learn. It forced engineers to solve problems. It forced management to coordinate talent across organizations. And most importantly, it transformed a strategic weakness into internal capability. The GT40 was therefore more than a racing car. It was the physical result of a company learning how to compete in an arena where it had once been an outsider. There is a deeper business lesson inside the rivalry. Sometimes the fastest way to enter a market is acquisition. Buy the brand, buy the technology, buy the talent, buy the distribution. But when the acquisition fails, the company faces a choice: abandon the market or build the capability itself. Ford chose the second path, and that choice created something acquisition could never have produced in the same way. It forced Ford to learn. It forced engineers to solve problems. It forced management to coordinate talent across organizations. And most importantly, it transformed a strategic weakness into internal capability. The GT40 was therefore more than a racing car. It was the physical result of a company learning how to compete in an arena where it had once been an outsider. Ferrari had the heritage. Ford had the scale. Ferrari had the racing dynasty. Ford had the industrial machine. And when the two finally collided at Le Mans, the result changed automotive history. But if you had been Henry Ford II in 1963, would you have walked away after Ferrari rejected the deal? Or would you have done exactly what Ford did? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about the corporate wars, financial disasters, strategic decisions, and scandals hiding behind the world's biggest companies, subscribe to Lexera. A failed deal created a rivalry. A rivalry created a challenge. And that challenge created a machine that changed racing history. This is what happens when corporate competition becomes personal, and personal competition becomes strategy. Behind every empire, there is a decision. Behind every decision, there is a risk. And behind every risk, there is a consequence. This is Lexera, uncovering corporate scandals, financial disasters, and business strategy.